Well, the easiest way to understand how the client connects is let's just kind of follow the connection trail. First of all, we'll talk about Pi SDK based clients. If you recall, there are two different types of clients. We'll talk about the SDK clients first. Now, these are typically those clients that are the more modern ones, Process Book and Data Link and things like the system management tools. So the first thing the client needs to know, it's trying to connect to a server, it needs to know what is the default server and what is the user ID associated with that default server. Now, in the case of this Pi SDK based client, we're going to look in something called the known servers table. It's not a table that we really expose to customers. It's basically a Windows registry entry. But we're going to look in there, and that's what we're going to use to populate our connection dialog box for our SDK based applications. Now, this is the connection dialog box for the SDK based applications. Let me close this and open it up again. You can get that by choosing File, Connections within any SDK-based application. I can learn from this. First of all, I can learn which servers are on my known servers table, and it's this list of servers here. And I can also see by the information down here that the default server is NICGX280. So I know for a fact that that is my default server. So a connecting client by default, unless explicitly told to connect to a different server, is going to go to that server right there. Now in this case, that server has been configured with the user PyAdmin. So now we know what default user goes with that. Also, when we first configure this, let me add a new server here. When you first add a server, when you specify the name of that user, you can also specify a password. So that's information we may or may not have stored here. In this case, I believe I did not store a password because PyAdmin does not have a password on this machine. But we'll demonstrate it both with and without a password. So that's the information that we gather from the SDK-based client, or when an SDK-based client tries to connect. Now, in the case of an API-based client, remember, the API-based clients would be the older versions of things like Process Book and Data Link, the version 2.x versions of those clients, and also all of the modern interfaces. Now, those are going to make use of a file called pylogin.ini. You're going to find this in the default directory for all Pi clients. So let me demonstrate where that is, and I'll show you the file. I'll go to the Windows registry, to the Windows Explorer, and as you can see right here, this is under the directory called Program Files, PyPC, and it's in the DAT directory. Within that DAT directory, you'll find a file called pylogin.ini. This pylogin.ini is where we identify for all API-based applications what the defaults are. So, as you can see, there are a lot of different servers listed here. And if we look at the defaults section, we can see that the default Pi server is, well, it's that same server, NICGX280. Now, what is the default user that goes with this? Well, for that, we have to do a little inspecting here. NICGX280 is that right there. That maps to a computer called Pi 6. So Pi 6 maps to Pi 6 user. This is the default user that is associated with that particular computer. So using two different methods, we've now determined the first things that we'll need to know before we can connect. We need to know what the default server is and what the default user is for this connection. Now moving on further, again, pretending that we're the connecting client, let's take a look at what that client will do. First of all, if and only if that client can connect to the server, because obviously if we can't connect to the server using TCP/IP, then we don't attempt to connect at all. I mean, we can't go any further at that point. But if we can connect, we will actually check for a qualifying trust. The server, I should say, will check to see if there is a trust that allows entry for this particular client. Now, we haven't discussed trusts yet, but let me just demonstrate what I'm talking about. If we can switch over to the system management tools, if I go into the security section and trusts, we can see there's a single trust that's been built for this particular server. This is a trust that is looking for a connecting client using that IP address. And if if there is a connecting client that has that IP address, we will grant that client the same privileges as the user Pi admin. Well, let's see what happened when ProcessBook, which is up and running right now, up and running and connected. See, the connection has already been made. Let's see what happens when ProcessBook connected. And to do that, I'm going to go into Operations and Message Logs. And I'm not going to refresh this screen because, yeah, this is what I was hoping to see. This is from a little while ago, a couple of hours ago. But this was when I connected for the first time using, or when I connected this most recent time using ProcessBook. And as you can see, there is a trust request. The Pi base subsystem has been requested. Is there a trust for this connecting client? Now, let me double click on this so that we can see it a little better. If we look at this right here, right underneath here, we're seeing the connecting credentials that have been passed by the connecting client. The connecting client has passed the following credentials. It says, well, the Windows domain is OSI, the Windows user is Nick, the computer is called NickGX280, the IP address is that, and the application is this right here. Well, those are fine connecting clients, but as we saw, there is no trust defined that will allow that connecting client to get into the system. So that's why we say this: there is no trust relation. We do not, we do not see that there's an existing trust that will allow this connecting client. So that's why in this case it fails. Now, when the connecting client fails, the next thing we check, or we try to do, is we simply check to see if the username has a password associated with it. Let me get back here and explain what I mean. Yeah. So if there is no trust, if there is a trust, then we would go ahead and allow the trust login. But if there is no trust, we will determine what the default user is, and if there is no password associated with that user, we will simply allow the connection. Okay. If there is a password, then we're going to throw up a login dialog box and request the user type in a password. Now, again, going back to my message log, as you can see, at this point right here, we did, right after the trust failed, we did accept the connection from ProcessBook. And the reason we did that, and we did that actually without throwing up a user password prompt, is because the connecting ProcessBook, it's connecting with the default user PiAdmin, and currently PiAdmin has no password required. So in our next video, we'll see what happens when you do put a password on PiAdmin. In the last two videos, we learned a lot of theory, so let's put it into practice. Let's go into the trust database and let's add a trust. I'm going to create a new trust that will allow me to connect to the server NickGX280. So I'm going to call this, let's call this MyTrust1. And this is going to be for an SDK based application, ProcessBook. And what I'm going to specify here, let's do it this way. Let's just say that we want this to be trusted because it is the computer called NickGX280. And actually, I can get even more specific. I can say, okay, let's make this trust even more restrictive. Let's only allow it to connect if we have that as the application name and that as the computer name. And then when we do get that, we will be granted privileges as, let's say we'll be granted the same privileges as PiAdmin. Now, once I've done that, once this trust is in place, we should be able to see, here's the trust definition. If the connecting client passes these connection credentials, that executable, and that network path, then we should have a connection. So let's, this should be a bit of high drama here. Let me see if I can disconnect, explicitly disconnect, and reconnect. And let's see what we get in our message log. So go into Operations, Message Logs. Let me refresh this. And there we go. If you take a look right here, I shouldn't act surprised. Of course it worked. If you look at this, we have identified now that this particular connecting client is going to be granted the trust called MyTrust1. And it was granted that because it passed the criteria. ProcBook was the name of the process. That was the name of this. So now we've got a new way of connecting. That's what's going to happen if a trust is, if we do match the connection criteria required in that trust. Now let me go ahead and delete that trust, and let me show you an alternative way. Let me delete this. So now we're back to where we were before. Let's do something else to mix it up a little bit. Let's go into users and let's require a password on PyAdmin. Right now PyAdmin doesn't have a password. And what I'd like to do, and I'm sorry, this is the wrong place to do it. I'm currently logged in as the PyAdmin user. So I'm going to go ahead and change the password. Currently there is no password, and I'm going to create a password. Now watch what happens when we attempt to connect using ProcessBook. I'll go ahead and switch over, and let me close out of this. Let's go into ProcessBook, and I'll go ahead and disconnect and reconnect. And notice what happened. This is the first time we've seen this. We've been prompted with a password. That's because that user now has a password required. I'll type my password here, and that should reflect in the message log. If we look at the message log, we should see that this connection has been made. This time it's been made slightly differently. So let's see if we can find. Yes, here's the fail. Since I deleted, the trust was granted earlier, and then I deleted the trust, and so when we try that trust connection again, that fails. So we don't get access to that. We do get a successful login though. So if you notice, we get successful login, name ProcessBook, the user PyAdmin. So as you can see, those are the methods, or those are the mechanisms and the sequences that we're going to use when we connect from clients that are SDK based.